Well, hello there, Bio-50 students. Today we're going to talk about the tissues, and so because of that, in Chapter 4, you don't have this picture, but I decided to put this picture up here to give you a quick reminder of what the four body tissues are. Number 1, we have nervous tissue. Let me see if my pen's going to work. Number 2, epithelial tissue. Number 3, muscle tissue, and number 4, connective tissue. We're not going to talk about them in this order, but I want to point this out here in this figure or diagram of an individual because you're going to see tissues, different tissues, basically all over the body. It's just different parts of the body are made up of more or less of the different types of tissue. So nervous tissue is going to be brain, spinal cord, the nerves of the body. The nervous tissue is responsible for communication, quick communication in the body. If you think about power lines, that's kind of what the nervous system and the nerves are all about. Epithelial tissue is actually basically skin. So if you look at the surface of the body and the surface of organs, they're typically going to be covered with an epithelial layer of stacked, thin cells. Different organizations of epithelium do different jobs. The inside of hollow organs, let's say, for example, the stomach is hollow, right? Because we put food into it and food moves through the stomach. Right here, the stomach right there, right? It's also lined with an epithelial tissue. So the epithelial tissue helps protect and do other jobs, and we'll get to that later. Muscle tissue is designed simply for contraction and movement of different organs. We have cardiac muscle, which is only found in the heart. Smooth muscle that you're going to find in internal organs and blood vessels. And then skeletal muscle. We break this down into skeletal muscle being voluntary, right? Because you can volunteer to move your skeletal muscle. But cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary, right? I believe you've already heard this. These are involuntary because no matter how far or how hard I think about it, I can't sit here and go, contract, contract, and make my heart contract. Now, can I psych myself out and stress myself out enough that my heart will start beating faster if I think of something really scary? I can do that, but that's a different type of muscle activation. That's through the autonomic nervous system. That's a totally different thing, okay? So cardiac muscle has its own intrinsic rhythmicity and intrinsic contraction. Smooth muscle, also kind of different from skeletal muscle. We'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. And then connective tissue. Connective tissues are tissues that connect other things together. So believe it or not, fat is a connective tissue. It usually kind of allows for a, it's like a pillow, right? It's a buffering and an insulating layer underneath the skin. It's actually super important to have adequate fat stores because without that, our body will not be able to maintain body temperature. You get bruised very easily. It's really important if you're like, let's say, for example, a seal out in the ocean. They have to have a thick fat padding blubber layer to keep them warm in the water. Humans, not so much because we're in ambient air here and on the ground, but out of the water. But we still rely on our fat for insulation. Other connective tissues are bone, tendon, and don't forget blood. That's the one connective tissue that connects the whole body, all the systems to one another. Okay, so we're going to just start with epithelial tissues, move on to connective, then muscle, then nervous tissue. We're going to talk about the form and the function of each. But let's start first now with what is a tissue. Tissue is a group of similar cells and everything else with those cells that allow them to stick together and do a job, okay? So tissues are going to involve usually more than one type of cell. And we'll see that as we move on through this lecture. The body tissues, epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle tissue, all have numerous cells. A lot of times you're going to find stem cells in there that may replace other cells within that tissue that has died. Now, one of the exceptions of that is nervous tissue in the brain and in the spinal cord. However, nervous tissue on the nerves, when you get out in the body, that tissue can be replaced. There are stem cells for that. So we'll talk about that as we move on. So let's start with epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissues are like skins. They cover and line outer and inner surfaces of organs. Okay, so if you have an organ that has a hollow lumen, a hollow space inside of it, there's going to be an epithelial layer in there. So like even in the heart chambers, there's an epithelial layer in there. Epithelial tissues are broken down into a few different types, all right? And this is what's going to be important for the quiz. The first type is the simple squamous epithelium. This is where you have just like a single layer of flattened cells that are really, really skinny. Okay, it really looks like almost like cellular paper. You're going to find this inside of the lungs where gas exchange occurs in the alveoli. You'll find them lining blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. And what's the point? It's to facilitate diffusion from one space to the next. In other words, if you're looking at an epithelial layer, which kind of in the lungs looks kind of like this, even in blood vessels, right? Yeah, I still need to take that art course, don't I? In the lung, all right, so let's pretend we're looking at lungs, oxygen can diffuse into the blood, and CO2 can diffuse out. We'll talk about this in more detail later on when we talk about the respiratory system. But these epithelial cells are really thin. They're kind of stacked up next to each other, and they allow diffusion to occur, all right? They can also allow filtration and osmosis. Let's hope not osmosis in the lungs, right? We don't want that. It's called drowning. The next type of tissue is stratified squamous. This has lots and lots of layer. The outermost layer, it looks actually pretty squamous, flattened, okay? But the stratified squamous, what's interesting about this is it allows a lot of protection between two areas. So I'm going to make my line here between these two cell types, the simple squamous and the stratified squamous. So you'll find this inside of your mouth. Big deal there, right? You're always putting stuff in your mouth. Or at least I am, because I love to eat, okay? But you don't want, let's say, some of the acid from the lemon juice that you used on your chicken to diffuse into your bloodstream. So we have the stratified squamous epithelium inside your cheeks that keep those very kind of, nasty, high, or I guess you'd say low pH solutions from getting into your bloodstream, right? And that'll go all the way from your mouth through your esophagus down to your stomach. Also on the surface of our skin, the epidermis, all of that stratified squamous epithelium is intended for protection. In other words, this thing is tall, lots of cells on top, lots of cells in between, and nothing gets through, all right? Nothing gets through this stuff. All right, so simple squamous, stratified squamous. Squamous, I love that word squamish. It's like squeamish, right? It just means that you have that single flattened layer of cells, usually on the top. 1, 2, 3. Simple columnar. These guys are fun. They just look like columns right next to each other, like this. Usually the nuclei are down low. There is a basement membrane here and here. Again, it's protection. It's hard to get stuff through this layer. You can get stuff out from these cells if it gets pumped out. You'll find this in your stomach, intestines, part of the respiratory tract, but you're usually going to find these columnar cells, tall and narrow with microvilli on top. We'll talk about that later though. And that specializes in absorption. Remember what we said in the last chapter? Or not in the last, well, yeah, chapter 2. Whatever you eat and whatever you absorb, you become. The simple columnar epithelium helps us to absorb things, and respiratory tract should be up there. So number 1, simple squamous. Number 2, stratified squamous. Number 3, simple columnar. Let's go back now to stratified transitional. Stratified transitional is really kind of funky. You only find that in one place in the body pretty consistently. It's in the urinary bladder. And so what you have is lots of layers of cells that are kind of stacked up close to each other, and they're kind of like real rubbery, like a bungee cord. And as the urinary bladder stretches, these shapes stretch out with it. And you'll see a picture of that in a little bit. The whole point is that the urinary bladder is able to expand, and that layer is protective. Stuff won't get out of the urinary bladder. How gross would that be, right? Pseudostratified, that's our last group. All right, so let's say them again. Simple squamous, stratified squamous. Why am I doing this over and over? Well, yeah, I changed slides, but this is how you remember this stuff. Simple columnar, stratified transitional, right? The urine transitions out of the urinary bladder. That's how I remembered it. It's dumb. And then you have your pseudostratified epithelial layers, which again are really important for protection. You'll find them lining some of the tubes of the body, like the trachea, going down into the respiratory pathways. You have a single layer of like what look like really tall cells, all right? But then there are other things that you'll find in between. Now, it turns out that these cells are not all stacked inappropriately. It just, they look like they're stratified, but they're not. It's just they're stacked more tightly together, and you'll see that in a few minutes. Simple cuboidal is our last set, so here we go. One more review time. Simple squamous, number 1. Stratified squamous, number 2. Simple columnar, tall guys like columns. That's why that's columnar. Stratified transitional, urinary bladder, so the urine will transition out of your body. Pseudostratified in the trachea, number 4. So, 3, 4. Oh my gosh, Dr. Val can't count. You know what? It's hard to count and write and think at the same time. There we go. And then number 6, simple cuboidal. Single layer cells that look like little cubes. You'll find these mostly in glands, and they're really important for secretion and absorption. A lot of times in glands, these simple cuboidal cells are organized in like things that look like little flower clusters almost, little rosettes, little circles. And they're going to be spitting out all kinds of stuff from usually that's been synthesized in the rough ER and in the Golgi. And those simple cuboidal cells might be making hormones, steroid hormones. They might be making proteins, all kinds of fun stuff. So here's a drawing showing what squamous, cuboidal, and columnar look like. A lot of times the modifications you're going to find on these columnar epitheliums, cell surface modifications like the cilia here, or microvilli, which you'll see later. So simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple, right? Simple columnar, and then pseudostratified. This is what I meant, is like it looks like they're stratified, like you have a cell here and a cell here, but these really are columnar cells. It's just they're so packed in tightly together that where you cut it in half transversely, you end up only getting part of one of the cells next to these two here. Now, these are the simple cells you find in the lung air sacs and the alveoli. The simple cuboidal you'll find in the thyroids and the ovaries. Simple columnar in the stomach, intestines, and in the respiratory tract. Pseudostratified in the trachea. Stratified cell layers, you have the stratified squamous. So again, you have the squamous, the squishy ones on top, the flattened ones. Transitional relaxed, this is what you find in the urinary tract and in the urinary bladder. It's more in the bladder than anything else. But that's how this urinary bladder can expand, because all these cells are kind of glued to each other, and they act like a bungee cord. You'll see a picture of that when we talk about the urinary system. And then here's our transitional stretch down here. It looks a little better when we look at the urinary bladder tissue, but here's the transitional stretch, transitional epithelium stretched. Here's transitional relaxed. All right, so let's move on to the connective tissue. Connective tissue consists of, number 1, areolar, loose connective tissue. This is just all the junk fibers, and they look like microtubules, fibroblast cells. Okay, and I'm going to write that down here. F-I-B-R-O-B-L-A-S-T, fibroblast. Fibroblast cells actually make these fibers, okay? Hence, fibro. Blast means like immature cell. So these fibroblasts spit out the fibers that are going to trap the areolar cells inside of them. And you'll find these between tissues, in tissues between organs. And the whole purpose is to connect things together. It's like glue. Adipose tissue, so areolar is one, adipose tissue, fat, right, contains a lot of fat. Basically, you're going to find our adipose tissue in a few places. Under the skin, right? Immediately under the skin for protection, padding, insulation, support, and nutrient reserve, so energy reserve. But you're also going to find fat in the epiphyses of the long bones. And sometimes you'll find fat in the body cavities. So in the, excuse me, You'll find fat surrounding the heart. You'll find fat in the liver. You'll find fat surrounding the intestines. That's actually not a good thing, especially in the liver. That's fatty liver disease. So in those cases, you're having a huge amount of nutrient reserve, okay, energy reserve surrounding your organs, and that's not healthy. So we want to keep our adipose like under our skin and in our bones. Okay, you got to have some of that in your bones. Gives the bones protection, gives the bones also some energy if they need it. Pardon me. So number 1, areolar. Number 2, adipose connective. Number 3, dense fibrous connective tissue. This is what we refer to as tendon or ligament. Scar tissue can be dense fibrous, and basically it's lots and lots of collagen fibers. Oh my goodness, excuse me. I got a frog in my throat. Dense fibrous connective tissue is truly like big bungee cords, and they're like those big like rubber band type bungee cords. And basically what they do is they confer strength and flexibility to the body, but it also confers a really strong connection. So think about how strong your muscles are. Your muscles are super strong, and your muscles are used to move, or at least your skeletal muscle, to move the skeleton of the body. Well, in order to move the skeleton, they have to attach to the bones, right? So those tendons that attach muscle to bones have to be so strong that you can't rip the muscle off of the bone, right? Because that would be pointless. Now, does that happen sometimes? Yes, that's called a tendon rupture. Really nasty thing, okay? Don't ever want that. Ugh, gives me the creeps even thinking about it. So most of the time, these dense fibrous connective tissues are super strong. You also find it in ligaments, a piece of tissue holding bone to bone. Fascia. Fascia is like a big strip of fibrous connective tissue. You'll find that underneath the foot. You'll find fascia, even actually in some of your, in the tissues of the body, in the skin, near the epithelial tissue. We'll look at that later when we look at a model of the skin. Bone and cartilage. So numbering them again: areolar, number 1, adipose, number 2, dense fibrous, number 3. Bone and cartilage we kind of put together because when our bodies are starting to build a skeleton, it starts with cartilage. Cartilage is the first tissue laid down in the developing embryo that will become eventually bone. It's hard, but it's extremely flexible, all right? Has lots of a particular cell type called chondrocytes. Chondrocytes make and reproduce more cartilage, okay? Cartilage in a more mature body, like your body, you can find in the nasal septum. So if you wiggle your nose around gently, please, that kind of hard part, not near your nasal bone, but near the tip of your nose, is a part of the nasal septum. It extends downwards. The area overlying your ears, the top of your pinny, okay, the external ear, that's trachea. Your larynx, the rings of the trachea, don't push too hard in your throat, but you could try to find the rings of the trachea, all made out of cartilage, okay? You want this because these areas oftentimes may be put under pressure and they might require support. So for example, your trachea, you want that thing to stay open so you can breathe, right? So those cartilaginous rings in the trachea are light, flexible support structures. They keep the trachea open so that you can breathe easily and freely. Now, on the other hand, bone is calcified cartilage. What do I mean by that? Many of our bones, as we are growing, start developing new cells called chondrocytes. Or not chondrocytes, sorry, osteocytes. Ooh. Osteo is bone, chondro is cartilage. The osteocytes are going to add calcium to the surface of the bones. Actually, it's calcium and phosphate, making the bones very firm. All right. There is also a tremendous amount of collagen in bones. All right. So you have calcium, lots of cartilage, lots of other proteins, and not phosphorus, phosphate, thank you very much, in your bones. And that helps give you firm support, but bones are still somewhat flexible. Can you break them? Absolutely, right? Some of you have probably broken bones. Not fun. However, our bones heal beautifully when they're set properly. How does it do that? Well, those osteocytes come in and they just add new calcium and fix the bone, and off you go. The last type of connective tissue is blood and what we call hematopoietic. So we have areolar, number 1, adipose, number 2, dense fibrous, number 3, bone and cartilage, number 4, and blood slash hematopoietic cells. So blood consists of a couple different elements, a liquid element, which is the plasma, and then the cellular element, which are the red and white blood cells, plus other little cell fragments that are used in clotting. But basically the idea is blood is a liquid matrix with cellular components. What's the point of blood? Transportation. Blood transports nutrients, waste products, oxygen, gases basically throughout the body through blood vessels. All right. So blood is a transport system. Hematopoietic cells, on the other hand, also have a liquid matrix, but they also have cells that make blood cells, the formed elements of the blood system, right? The red and the white cells. So hematopoietic cells you're going to find in the red bone marrow, in long bones, and actually in some of the other unique bones, like in the ribs, there's a little bit of this. And basically the hematopoietic cells make new blood cells, red and white. All right. So I've always considered blood and hematopoietic cells kind of more similar than different. It just depends on who you talk to. For the purposes of this lecture and this class, I think I put blood and hematopoietic together. All right, so here's some pictures of connective tissue. Here's adipose tissue. What I think is so funny about adipose tissue is this big white circle. That's all triglyceride or fat. And that's the nucleus, little tiny nucleus there. The dense fibrous connective tissue actually looks a little bit like muscle, striated muscle, but it actually isn't. These are just large bundles of collagen fibers. Bone tissue looks actually like a piece of wood, right? Like tree rings. Bone tissue is amazing because each one of these little holes is called an osteon, or the hole itself is a Halberdian canal. And inside of these little canals, you're going to find one of two things. In the central canal here, which connects up to some of these Halberdian canals, you're going to find a vein, an artery, and a nerve. In these little kind of more elongated holes, you're going to find the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, the cells that remodel bone. And these little osteons, this circular structure is going to change depending on what you do. If you work out a lot, if you get a lot of high intense exercise, you'll have very strong bones. If you don't do very much, these bones might become stripped of calcium and phosphate and you'll have weaker bones. Cartilage over here, which becomes bone eventually, has this matrix, and these are the individual chondrocytes that make cartilage. What is the matrix? Matrix is like this jelly substance. It's kind of what makes the cartilage kind of stretchy and loose. It's not gooey. It's not like blood, but this matrix is like a real sticky set of proteins. And then blood, in this picture, you're looking at the liquid matrix, which is the plasma. Okay, it kind of looks yellowy there. Red blood cells look kind of like frisbees. I kind of think of them as red frisbees. And then that white blood cell in the middle looks kind of bigger. Not all white blood cells are bigger than red blood cells, and there's a variety, which we can get to later. But these white blood cells are essential for protecting our body from invading pathogens. In other words, that's part of your immune system. All right, we're going to move on to muscle tissue now. We're going to start with skeletal, striated, voluntary muscle tissue. Number 1, it's probably the most popular type of muscle. Skeletal muscle has really long cells, all right? In fact, each skeletal muscle cell is as long as the muscle. So think about it for a minute. Just stop for a minute, and I want you to look at your bicep on your arm. You don't have to make a muscle, but if you want to, knock yourself out. My muscle doesn't look very big, so it's kind of disappointing, but you probably look a lot better than me. Anyways, those bicep individual skeletal muscle cells start way up in your shoulder at the origin and extend all the way down to right around your elbow in the where it connects to, I don't want to go into all the details yet, but where it connects to the insertion, okay? So the muscle attaches to the bicep brachialis, connects to 2 points, and the length of that muscle is how long each muscle cell is. That's a long cell. They're really skinny, but it's a really long cell. What does skeletal muscle allow you to do? Move voluntarily. You have muscle, skeletal muscle, moving your eyeballs around. You have skeletal muscle. One of the smallest skeletal muscles is along the length of your nose. It helps you move your nose around when you are, sneezing and stuff. Part of it's in the esophagus. You'll find some in the esophagus, in the upper part. Again, it helps you move. It helps you maintain posture. And basically, the skeletal muscle is almost exclusively and always involved in voluntary action. Now, can you cause your ears to lift up by thinking about it? Can you voluntarily do that? I can't, but some people can. There are muscles that'll move your ears upwards. Go look in the mirror and smile. Boop, your ears will go right up. So skeletal muscle, number 1. Cardiac striated muscle, number 2. Cardiac striated muscle looks a lot like skeletal muscle. It has these striations, which we'll look at in a few minutes, but they also branch and interconnect with one another. And I'll show you what that is in a few minutes. You always find cardiac muscle in the walls of the heart, which makes it the myocardium, okay? And it's responsible for contracting the heart, all right? So again, it's movement. All right, number 1, skeletal muscle. Number 2, cardiac muscle. Number 3, smooth involuntary muscle. And the smooth muscle is non-striated. Another way of referring to smooth muscle is visceral muscle, because it's a part of the viscera, your guts, okay, in your abdominal cavity. Although you will find smooth muscle in other areas too, like in blood vessels. These are long cells again, and in this case, they only have one nucleus, unlike skeletal and cardiac muscle. Actually, skeletal and cardiac muscle, I forgot to mention, they both have multiple nuclei, okay? Where do you find smooth muscle? Oh my gosh, it's almost like, where don't you find it? You find it in the reproductive system, in blood vessels. You find it in the respiratory system. You find it inside of glands. Basically, you find it inside of the muscles. They're called intrinsic eye muscles. Those are the muscles inside of your eyeball, not on the outside, moving the eyeball. And what these intrinsic smooth muscle fibers do is allow the iris to contract or relax to let more or less light into the eyeball. Erector pili muscles. When you get the goosebumps and the hairs stand up on your arms and on the back of your neck, that's because smooth muscle contracts and pulls the little hairs upright. Kind of fun, right? It's when you go see a scary movie. All the smooth muscle allows is movement again. It just depends on where it's located. That's kind of where what dictates what the movement is. So this is what muscle tissue looks like, and we'll be looking at this in our virtual slide box. Skeletal muscle is striated. It has these little long bands along the length of each one of these muscles. In this particular muscle, and in this one up here, you can see in this muscle there's one nucleus here, but in this muscle you have 1, 2, 3 nuclei associated with it. So again, remember, each muscle fiber, skeletal muscle fiber, has more than one nucleus. Cardiac muscle, also striated. Each one of these little hash marks here, these little striations. Now, each one of these little regions here, those are called intercalated discs. And those intercalated discs have little pathways that allow one cell to pass compounds to the next cell in line. When we talk about muscle physiology, I'm going to talk about those intercalated discs and those channels called gap junctions. And I'll define how those work and how it leads to the smooth contraction of the heart. And then we have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle looks smooth, no striations. Each smooth muscle fiber has a single nucleus. They're pretty short, even though this looks like a big band. But it doesn't look quite as exciting, but it does all kinds of really interesting things. And when we start talking about the digestive system, we'll talk about some crazy things like, what is nausea? Nausea is a byproduct of smooth muscle contraction gone crazy. Last thing we're going to talk about is nervous tissue. So how'd that get there? Sorry about that. I don't know why. Oh, that's just right here. So nervous tissue is at the bottom of my muscle slide here. Nervous tissue, man, you're going to find this in the brain, spinal cord, nerves. There are a lot of different shapes of nervous tissue cells. As we go through the nervous system, I will show you specific shapes. I have a few shapes coming up here in a minute. But basically, the nervous tissue is responsible